Welcome back to the Drunk on Writing Stephen King Dissections. In today's episode, brought to you in part by the patronage of Ariya Norinth, we're going to talk the 1982 cult classic Creepshow, directed by the legendary George Romero, as well as its comic adaptation from the same year. Yeah, that's right. The film actually came first this time. Weird, right? Before we get started, I just want to remind you can get early access, exclusive videos, and a whole lot more by becoming a Drunk on Writing patron at drunkonwriting.com, which is also where you can pick up the official Drunk on Writing t-shirt. All that said, let's dissect. Creepshow has the honor of being both Stephen King's acting and screenwriting debut, and what a debut it was. He not only got to team up with George Romero, he also had the adaptation handled by another legend, Bernie Wrightson, co-creator of Swamp Thing. A fun fact, given one of the anthology stories. And the cast includes the likes of Leslie Nielsen, Ted Danson, Hal Holbrook, Adrienne Barbeau, and Ed Harris. The film actually originated as an idea Romero had for an anthology film that had sort of traced the history of horror films. As noted by Birth Movie's Death, each vignette would be set in a different era, from a Val Lewton-inspired B&W chiller to the in-theater gimmicks of William Castle to a 3D segment meant to cap the entire affair. At the time, Romero was also talking with King, who has confessed to being a huge fan of Romero. I mean, he goes on at length in Danse Macabre about Night of the Living Dead as being one of the cornerstones of modern horror film. They were talking about doing an adaptation of either Salem's Lot or The Stand, and of course Salem's Lot would go on to become a TV show, and The Stand could not get funding, at least at the time. And it was King who suggested they actually shift the focus of the anthology to focus more on the EC and DC horror comics that they both happened to read as children. You know, the likes of The Haunt of Fear, House of Mystery, and the ever-popular Tales from the Crypt. Note, the infamous Tales from the Crypt TV series and its eventual films wouldn't appear until the end of the decade, so Creepshow was well ahead of that and similar treatments. Now, King wrote the script for Creepshow in about 60 days, and they started shopping it around, but nobody would pick it up. Nobody wanted this thing, so they ended up falling back on a deal that Romero had. A 3-picture deal with United Film Distribution Company, which later merged with Artists Entertainment Group to become Taurus Entertainment Company. The other two movies from the deal being the earlier Dawn of the Dead and the 1985 Day of the Dead. Creepshow was given a budget of roughly $8 million, the largest amount that Romero would get to work with until 1990's Two Evil Eyes, and earned a little over $21 million in the US. Not too shabby, especially given its cult status. And it was almost entirely shot with a shaky cam, mind you, that was extremely nausea-inducing for the first 10 minutes of it. It was almost completely shot in Pittsburgh and its surrounding suburbs, which is apparently a Romero tradition, with the bulk of the filming taking place in the empty Penn Hall Academy in Greensburg, Pennsylvania, which was converted into a pseudo-studio and eventually a Siemens Energy Corporation building. History is pretty weird, but you can get more information about the making of Creepshow through the making of documentary, Just Desserts, which first appeared as a DVD extra. And I highly recommend you do, even if it lacks any commentary from King himself. But before we go and dive into all of the individual stories, I want to give you a little bit more background information here, because there is one aspect of Creepshow that really differentiates the film from all other similar titles, including Tales from the Crypt. And that is the movie's, for lack of a better term, comic book effects. Tom Savini came on to handle those and the prosthetic effects, and if you don't know that name, you really should, and you're kind of messing up here. He's not only handled special effects, makeup, and stunts for the likes of Dawn of the Dead and the original Friday the 13th, he's also a director and has appeared in a number of films, including those two that I just mentioned, as well as From Dusk Till Dawn, Planet Terror, Django Unchained, and, most notable for this dissection, in Creepshow, as one of the garbage men at the end of the film. For me, probably the most interesting and perhaps unknown aspect of Savini's entire work history is that he was a combat photographer for the U.S. Army in Vietnam. Again, bringing that whole Stephen King connection full circle. But Savini and his cohorts used a combination of cell animation, lighting gels, and stop motion to create these just breathtaking effects. Groundbreaking at the time, even. Along with artists Jack Kamen, the aforementioned Bernie Wrightson, and Jim Novak on lettering. And for the more practical special effects, they actually imported a skeleton from India and 18,000 cockroaches from Trinidad. Yeah, 18,000. But speaking of Bernie Wrightson, let's talk the adaptation. Yes, it's a little odd to talk the written form after the film version, but like I said, history is weird sometimes, and here we are. The comic, simply titled Stephen King's Creepshow, was released by Plume in July 1982, a few months after the film's Cannes Film Festival debut, but a few months before its widespread review. So some people think that it was released before the film, others clearly state that it was released afterwards, which is actually the correct notion. It was drawn by Bernie Wrightson, as I noted, who was assisted by his wife Michelle on coloring and lettering, though the cover was done by Jack Kamen, who was apparently a friend of the producer. That cover, interestingly, was completed before anything else on the movie and was used as something of a visual key. And you might note that the skeleton on the cover sort of looks like a skeletal Stephen King. Or is that just me? Now, to find out more about the comic adaptation, I went back and read this exhaustive interview that Bernie Wrightson had with the Comic Journal's executive editor, Gary Groth, published in the October 1982 issue of that magazine. Though you can go and read it online now at your ease. I'll include a link below. Now, the reason I wanted to do that is because the comic is rather different than the movie. The creep narrator, for one, which makes an appearance in the film, is far more prevalent. The wraparound narrative is completely dropped, and the stories are actually given in a different order. That's besides dozens of very minor tweaks here and there. So I kept wondering to myself as I was reading this, did Stephen King make these changes for the comic book? Why would he do that? Well, it turns out, though everywhere I looked, King is credited with writing this comic book, he wrote the screenplay, yes, and that is right on the cover. But it was Bernie Wrightson who actually put the words down for this comic book. He went through and edited it and deleted and made it so that this worked as a comic book. As noted in that interview that I mentioned, Stephen King offered to write the adaptation, and I told him I would prefer just to take the screenplay, which is this massive tome of a screenplay, something like 3,000 to 4,000 scenes. And I just took that and readapted it myself to comics. I did a lot of editing and deleting because it was just too much to put into 11 pages a lot of time because his dialogue is just so rich. But how did Wrightson even get involved with this project? I mean, it makes sense given he was so heavily influenced by EC Comics and his style, but in an interview with George Beam, as noted in the Stephen King Companion, Wrightson reveals that King called him up personally. I got a call one night. My wife gets the phone, hands it to me, and tells me it's Stephen King, who says, "Is this Bernie? This is Steve King. I'm in Pittsburgh, and I'm working on a movie with George Romero. It's an anthology movie with several stories from a horror comic. We are working with EC artist Jack Kamen, who is also working on the movie. We assumed Jack was doing the comic book version, but when we asked him about it, he said he didn't know what we were talking about. Is there any possibility you could do the comic book?" What's fun is that Wrightson, even before this, was a huge fan of Stephen King. As noted in that interview he did with the Comic Journal, Wrightson said, "What do I like about King? Damn near everything. The guy has an uncanny knack for creating characters who are just really solid people. A storyteller par excellence. Absolutely riveting from the first page. A terrific command of the language and colloquialism and slang and bullshit and whatever. And on top of that, he can scare the pants off me. I've read just about everything he's ever written at least twice, and it takes a really good writer to get me to read something more than once. I mean, he's good even when you know it's coming. You can go through it a second time and just marvel at how well he manipulates you. And you have to marvel at it because you can't figure out how he does it. It just works. It gets you all fired up and interested the second time around. Not many people can do that. I love that kind of stuff. And fans of King probably know this wouldn't be the last time the two would collaborate. Wrightson also did the illustrations for the 1985 Cycle of the Werewolf, the unabridged edition of The Stand in 1990, At the time of doing Creepshow, he was just rereading The Stand for the 5th time, the 2006 Wolves of the Calla, and covers for both From a Buick 8 and an issue of TV Guide dedicated to The Shining. He was also involved in the adaptations of The Mist and Riding the Bullet. Of course, if you haven't yet had the chance to read the comic take on Creepshow, I mean, it's been out of print for forever, pretty much, and can fetch something of a high price. It was just reissued by Gallery 13. I recommend you pick it up. It mimics a lot of what is seen in the movie, but it's all told in slightly different ways, in more comic book version. And it makes sense because Bernie actually went to the studio and hung out and watched what was going on and watched the dailies and used all of that as reference. So there's a lot of visual aspects of the film that he incorporates right into the comic book. Though, like I said, it has its differences. But of course, it's also worth noting that Creepshow wasn't the first time that a King's story was produced in comic form. That honor belongs to The Lawnmower Man, a 21-page adaptation by Walter Simonson, who you might better know for his run on Thor, published in the December 1981 issue of Marvel's Bizarre Adventures. It's a pretty bizarre story and pretty bizarre take, to be honest. So it's a pretty fitting publication. But there's an interesting aspect of The Lawnmower Man that I didn't really pick up on until just recently rereading it. And that's the fact that it has a connection to Creepshow. Because there's a reference to a Rich Kastenmeier. I'd always figured that Rich was a first name, but what if the character was really just truly Rich? And the Norman Kastenmeier mentioned in They're Creeping Up on You is that same character. It's all connected, right? It's all in the same kind of universe. I mean, Theyre exists pretty much everywhere. It's all part of the plan, as they say. But let's get back to Creepshow, which opens with a wee little prologue. Both this opening vignette and the closing epilogue feature Stephen King's son Joe King in his only acting role. As of yet, of course. Joe King would go on to become a well-known author of his own right under the pen name Joe Hill. The pair of shots also feature an actor who originally wanted to audition for the role of Jordy Verrill, Tom Atkins, whose film debut, surprisingly, was in another film that we've talked about before on Drunk on Writing, the Frank Sinatra-led The Detective. He plays an somewhat abusive father who finds the Creepshow comic in his son, Billy, Joe King's, room, and as he puts it, takes care of it. And so the film begins as a sort of reading of the comic, immediately jumping into those great comic effects I talked about. And before we talk about the segments, let's also briefly touch on the epilogue, which plays into those all too familiar comic ads that used to appear in every single magazine. And no, in this particular case, it's not the Sea Monkeys, but it is one that made an earlier appearance in the film. In this case, an actual working voodoo doll. I loved that scene, even if it really showed that Billy, Joe King, is a complete homicidal maniac, and I really wouldn't want to mess with him. Oh, there's just terrifying little boy. Oh, I don't know what it is about little boys with voodoo dolls. It's just creepy. But let's jump back to the opening segment, Father's Day. Father's Day was an original story written by Stephen King specifically for this film and filmed on location at a mansion in Fox Chapel, Pennsylvania. Generally, it's a straightforward sort of revenge tale against an abusive father, really fitting given the prologue, with a twist. A twist of the neck too, but a twist. But for me, it's probably the weakest of the segments. Though that might just because as a fellow New Englander, I know that in June, it is not midnight black outside at 7 p.m. The odd focus on the clock there in that entire scene pulled my wife and I right out of the segment, as did Ed Harris's rather ridiculous death as the film flashes between his character bewilderingly staring at a stone tomb perilously shifting toward him. I assume he was meant to be frozen in terror, in fear, but this isn't conveyed well at all, though it does play far better in the comic. Still, Father's Day has its highlights. I gave Ed Harris some flack right there, But the various ways in which his character lights matches, as well as his somewhat infamous dancing scene, they're phenomenal. As was Vivica Linford's portrayal of the traumatized alcoholic chain-smoking Aunt Bedelia. This segment also includes what very well may be the best line of the entire movie. When Romero regular Warner Shook's Richard walks into a dark room and quips,
"Are we conserving energy?"
Perhaps most notably, Father's Day offers a different take on a Romero zombie. Something I'm certain was quite welcome after the success of his first two Living Dead films, and maybe the reason why they put this one at the start of the film. And Wrightson's take is certainly something to behold, as he uses the separate panels of the comic to really demonstrate the decaying patriarch's slow advance on Aunt Bedelia. A tactic he'd put to perfect use again in both the Something to Tide You Over and the Crate segments as well. Though, that ending, with the granddaughter's head as a Father's Day cake, really rather weird, isn't it? I didn't quite understand that entirely. But I guess that sort of dovetails really nicely into the next segment of the movie, the lonesome death of Jordy Verrill. This King-starring short was based on a story that he wrote called Weeds, first published in the May 1976 issue of Cavalier, reissued in the April 1979 issue of Nugget, and later released in Shiver 7 in 2013 and Dark Screams Volume 1 in 2014. It's never been published in one of Stephen King's own collections. Now, Weeds was somewhat inspired by H.P. Lovecraft's The Color Out of Space, which details a great rock falling from the sky and poisoning 5 acres of farmland, including all of the vegetation, all of the livestock, and the farmer and his family. Simply put, it's pretty horrifying, which is exactly what you would expect from H.P. Lovecraft. And, odd connection here, if King hadn't pointed out himself that The Shining's title was taken from John Lennon's Instant Karma, I would assume that he was far more inspired by this H.P. Lovecraft story than he even let on, as the titular color is at one part called The Shining, and given this really rather fun little description. It was just a color out of space. A frightful messenger from unformed realms of infinity beyond all nature as we know it. From realms whose mere existence stuns the brain and numbs us with the black extra-cosmic gulfs it throws open before our frenzied eyes. Very Shining-like, right? But while The Color Out of Space deals with a graying decay of all life, King's Weeds and The Lonesome Death of Jordy Verrill, in turn, which was retitled as a reference to Bob Dylan's The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll, tackles an ever-growing alien life, one looking to kind of terraform Earth. Terraform, more like it, I guess, as the main character, Jordy Verrill, comes to discover. Here's how Verrill is described in the short story. Jordy wasn't bright. He had a potato face and large blocky hands that were as apt to hoe up the carrots as the weeds that grew between them, and he got along as best he could. He fixed cars and sold wood, and in the winter he drove Christmas trees down to Boston. Thinking was hard for him. Thinking hurt, because there was a dead short somewhere inside, and keeping at it for long made him want to take a nap or beat his meat and forget the whole thing. Basically, he's a town regular, even if King notes, when God hands out the smart pills, he gives some people placebos, and Jordy was one of those. But you feel for him. You can relate to him. So when he starts getting taken over by grass growing all over and inside of his body, it's awful. It's just truly awful. And maybe even more terrifying than the Lovecraft story. Especially when you get quotes like this one. He couldn't just rip the stuff out the way you would hoe up the witchgrass in your tomato sets. He couldn't do that because his eye was still in there someplace. Wasn't it? Or this one. In the glow of the kitchen light, Jordy was a monster. A monster in the true sense, nearly as ludicrous as it was terrifying. He looked like a walking privet hedge. The hedge was crying. It had no tears to cry, because the growth was mercilessly absorbing every bit of moisture that Jordy's failing systems could produce. But it cried just the same, in its fashion. And it was this scene, actually, this very particular scene that inspired today's beer pairing. Captain Lawrence Brewing Company's Tears of Green. This one actually dry hopped with Simcoe, Zeus, and Ella hops. It's a New England IPA, and obviously you can tell by the label why I chose this one. It's got these, flying cabbages coming down. It's hops, obviously. But what also fascinates me about this beer is that this is at least the third issue of this same beer, but every time they reissue the beer, it's different. The original one had Matuka and Mosaic hops. Then there was one with Vic's Secret and Citra hops. And like I said, this one has Simcoe, Zeus, and Ella hops. So it's sort of its own variety pack with just this beer. There's one beer, multiple different options. Very much like Creepshow and its multiple different options. It's multiple different segments, different stories, all are revolving around the same theme, but all very different, all very great. Speaking of which, let's get back to the lonesome death of Jordy Verrill. Wrightson's adaptation, which seems absolutely fitting given Jordy Verrill's Swamp Thing-like appearance toward the end of the story, is conveyed in much the same manner as the original short story. It's dark and terrifying in its own right. And the final page focus on Verrill's eye, which may or may not have turned after he so despondently tried to end his life, makes it even more so. Especially when combined with this little final quote from the short story. It put the gun to what had been Jordy Verrill's head. It could not pull the trigger by itself, but the tendrils helped. Perhaps curious to see if the bang would make the Jordy food more tasty. Is altogether just nasty. But the film version is wildly different. It's comedic, actually, with King pulling his best Tom Cullen and seemingly having the time of his life on screen. He was actually told to just act like Wile E. Coyote as he's going over a cliff by George Romero, so you can see what they were going for here. Honestly, I rather like it, even if the segments become the one that most people say is the weakest, if not one of the weakest, of the bunch. And I guess I kind of have to agree, because while I really like this, the stories just keep getting better as we roll through the movie. Like this next one, Something to Tide You Over. This segment's another one written specifically for the film, and I kind of love it. For two reasons. Ted Danson and Leslie Nielsen. Seeing them together in this largely humorless tale, seeing them out of their element. As a reminder, this is only a few years after Nielsen's starring turn in Airplane, and the exact same year that Cheers debuted. It's incredible. Though I will say, I actually like Wrightson's take on this tale, which he actually plays second to last in the comic book, a little more. While the film opens with Nielsen's Richard Vickers coming to Danson's Harry Wentworth's house and slowly builds toward the perfect shot of Harry succumbing to the tide, the comic literally dives right in and instead includes the exposition as a flashback. Speaking of that scene, Ted Danson revealed in a 2000 interview he did with the AV Club exactly how they filmed it. He said, "So they make a little aquarium tank. I got in a wetsuit and climbed in, and somebody would reach down with an oxygen tank ventilator thingy, and I'd breathe, and then they'd take that out. And there was a yoke made out of, wood and fake sand, so it looked like my head was buried in the sand, underwater. I would not have done that. No way. No how. I'm not getting into a tank and letting other people give me air. Just ain't happening. I mean, what if something had gone wrong? They had to have been concerned about Ted Danson's life in this entire sequence, because just water's getting thrown at him. It's like waterboarding the poor actor. I guess we do everything for our craft, right? I should note that Something to Tide You Over was filmed on location at a beachfront residence on the Jersey Shore. And like Father's Day before, it gives us another take on a Romero zombie. This time, a pair of drowned ones. Though they're also bent on revenge. I guess that's just a running theme with zombies. And I will say, kudos to the effects team, because the water pouring out of their wounds after they're shot, nice touch. Which is something I would say again in the very next segment, The Crate. The Crate was based on a short story by King of the same title, originally released in the July 1979 issue of Gallery. It was also collected in the Arbor House Treasury of Horror and the Supernatural in 1981 and Shiver 6 in 2010. As with Weeds before, it's never been published in an actual Stephen King collection. In short, The Crate tells of a crate found beneath the basement stairs of a very old academic building, which contains this monstrous creature that seemingly devours everything, leaving no trace of the bodies behind. Conveniently, as one of our, I guess you should call them protagonists, discovers. Every version of this tale, whether the original short story, the comic adaptation, or the film version, tells the same basic series of events, but they all differ in their own way. The original short story, for instance, starts off with the two characters meeting up to play chess, and then the sequence of events, everything that happens with the crate and the bodies, that's all told sort of in an exposition way. It's told in a conversational way. It's a flashback. So it's all built around the present reaching into the past. The film portrays it in a much more linear fashion, though with some daydream-like sequences, which is where that nice touch comes to play here. Cutting away to watch Henry shoot his wife, earning applause from all in attendance at the garden party? Magnificent. That garden party sequence, by the way, was shot in Romero's own backyard, while the Amberson Hall scenes, they were shot within Carnegie Mellon University's Margaret Morrison Hall. Wrightson's take, which he mentioned to George Beam, was probably the story that he put the most work into, and it shows, believe me. Includes that exact same scene, though later in the tale, but also gives the monster a Critters-like appearance, whereas Tom Savini gave the film's version a more, I guess, abominable ape-beast look. They fondly referred to the creature as Fluffy on set. Especially funny given how gruesome its bite is. And the short story described it as dry and brown and scaly as a desert reptile that had green gold eyes, 6 legs, and the flat bullet head of a young lynx. What's particularly cool to me is that there is a sort of progression of the endings. In the original short story, the last that we see of the crate is it being thrown into the water in the flooded quarry. Now, in the comic book version, we get a look at the creature reaching out from the sealed crate at the bottom of the quarry. And in the film, we actually see it break out of the crate. What I still don't understand, though, is how no one ever noticed that crate under there. Especially in the original short story, where there is no, grate covering the hole underneath the stairs. So you could have just kind of gone underneath there and seen it. But apparently no one has. This is even noted in the story. Stanley couldn't believe that anything very interesting could have escaped notice for long, just by being tucked under the stairs. Tens of thousands of people went up and down them every week during the academic year. I know I would have noticed. I went into all the little nooks and crannies in my schools, every single one that I could find, looking for those kind of things like that were hidden for about 100 years. Those are cool things. You find them in every little corner. They're fun. I have maybe a couple of them in my house now. But for a while there, I was actually wondering if someone had stumbled upon the crate at some point in the past and simply made use of it in the same way that Dex and Henry do in this version of the story, in the current story. Maybe they had, fed the monster someone and then just put it back. Or maybe the monster had eaten them and then quietly pulled themselves back. But then, you get the part about the dust and the boards being nailed down, the old nails, and that whole theory got put to bed. But it would have been cool, right? If it was just had this history of maybe it just has been slowly fed over the years and just put back in the corner. I thought that would have been a nice little twist. Oh well. Before we go on to the final segment, I want to note that the crate isn't the last time we saw the crate. At least if you were paying attention and looking for just sort of an Easter egg. In fact, the crate has appeared at least 2 other times. Probably more than that, but it has shown up in Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday, as well as Season 5 of The Walking Dead. Honestly, like I said, it's probably been in a whole lot more segments than that. I mean, it's a crate. It's a wooden crate. It could be anywhere. It can be in that scene in Indiana Jones with all the crates. You know, the one I'm talking about. Crates could be anywhere. I mean, they're like cockroaches, really, right? Which brings us to our final segment. They're Creeping Up on You is another one written specifically for the film. And it's absolutely the most disquieting. Despite being a relatively straightforward tale of a germaphobe, Upson Pratt, no Chris relation as far as I'm aware, who's haunted by cockroaches. Now, I say relatively because it is possible, and I can't say for any certainty here, that They're Creeping Up on You is actually a tale, a commentary on race in America. As pointed out by Jacob Knight, who wrote that article for Birth Movies Death. Just like Romero's earliest zombie work, They're Creeping Up on You is a sly commentary on race in America, as Pratt has no problem slinging racial slurs. The whiteness of his domicile standing in stark contrast to the blackness of the city below. He's a cruel man who's made his living off of exploiting the poor, and now his own prejudices have manifested themselves in the form of an all-consuming horde. Now, I didn't get that myself personally, but I'm also not one to particularly look for that kind of thing. I'm not, it's not what I read my fiction for. But Wrightson's adaptation might actually lend some additional credence to this theory, as Pratt in the comic version doesn't see any of the cockroaches. He doesn't notice a single one, despite the fact that they're crawling all around the place. A rich, racist white man, blind to the overwhelming problems surrounding him? Yeah, I can see that one, for sure. But that's not the reason They're Creeping Up on You is going to stick with me for some time. It's racist themes, I mean, we get those everywhere nowadays. Why this is going to haunt my thoughts for some time is that final scene. The one in which there doesn't seem to be a single bug anywhere. For a moment, I wondered, was all this just in his head? Did the cockroach represent the misdeeds that he had done on his way up the corporate ladder? It sort of makes sense, a nice little allegory. But no, not at all. We zoom in on Pratt's face and we watch it twitch and bubble, and then, well, we see the roaches burrow out of his body. Oh, it's awful. So many come out. It's like the room is flooded with them. Now, even if the bulk of the bugs in that shot is just nuts and raisins, not actually bugs that are real, it's terrifying. It's uncomfortable. It is just grotesque, but it is perfect, and I love it. Now, I don't have a ton of extra thoughts on Creepshow. I've sort of peppered them throughout this dissection, so I'm not going to have a closing note section. What I'm going to do with this dissection is actually close it out by talking about Creepshow's inevitable sequels and sort of its legacy. For one, it did have a direct sequel, Creepshow 2, which we'll talk about at some point down the line. It was released in 1987. But unlike the original Creepshow, there were some budget constraints, and one of the planned segments actually got cut from Creepshow 2 and wound up in another movie, Tales from the Dark Side, the movie, which Tom Savini has been quoted as being the real Creepshow 3. Because there was a Creepshow 3 as well, though Stephen King, George Romero, and basically every single other person involved in the first two movies, none of them were involved with Creepshow 3. And that one was released direct-to-video back in 2007. A web series called Creepshow Raw debuted back in 2008, though only a pilot series was ever actually produced. And another series, also called Creepshow, was announced just last year with Greg Nicotero of The Walking Dead fame attached to produce. This one's supposed to include at least 2 Stephen King-based episodes on Survivor Type, which we haven't talked about yet. It's in the Skeleton Crew collection. And one that we have talked about, Gray Matter, back from the Night Shift collection. We'll see how those come along, and we'll talk about them when they come out, and we do, and we have to discuss them. But of course, Creepshow's success in the film and its picking up of the subsequent sequels probably helped lead, at least in part, to the pickup of Tales from the Crypt and other sort of anthology horror films like the Friday the 13th anthology series, etc. and so forth. They were all over the place for a while. I mean, you even look at it nowadays. We get stuff like Black Mirror. We get stuff like American Horror Story. Those are all pretty much anthology series telling different stories that are fun. And maybe they trace their roots back to Creepshow. Oh, and by the way, Creepshow wasn't the last time that Stephen King and George Romero would partner up on a project. They'd actually reunite for the 1993 The Dark Half, but we'll get to that another time. For now, this has been the Drunk on Writing dissection of Creepshow, and it proved far more interesting than I ever thought it actually would. Isn't that fun, how that turns out? If you enjoyed it anywhere near as much as I did, please be sure to like the episode, subscribe to the channel, and if you're really feeling up to it, head on over to drunkonwriting.com where you can become a Drunk on Writing patron and get access to exclusive shows, early access to every single show, and so much more. I hope I see you there, and until I do, cheers, as always, and keep on writing.